Welcome back to Mysteries Unfolding. Today, we're exploring cases with unexpected and astonishing turns. Some of these narratives are so incredible, they seem like they belong in a movie script rather than reality. Yet every one of them is entirely true. Our first case is both shocking and complex, featuring more twists than you could possibly anticipate. This is not a typical murder story. It encompasses not just one tragedy, but a series of them woven together in an almost unbelievable fashion. As a teenager, Sharon Marshall seemed to have a bright future ahead of her. She was a lieutenant colonel in the ROTC and ranked among the most gifted students in her class. A young woman of undeniable intelligence and a compassionate heart. After graduating from high school in Forest Park, Georgia in 1986, Sharon was awarded a full scholarship to the Georgia Institute of Technology. She intended to study aerospace engineering to pursue her dream of working for NASA. However, despite this remarkable opportunity, Sharon never attended college because she was concealing a secret. During the last few months of high school, Sharon was pregnant by her boyfriend, whom she never informed about the baby. She managed to hide her secret effectively, eventually giving birth and allowing an affluent couple from Texas to adopt the baby boy. Nevertheless, the pregnancy disrupted her life plans, and at one point, she reportedly made an unsuccessful attempt to run away with her boyfriend. Having forfeited her chance to go to college, Sharon relocated to Tampa, Florida for a fresh start with a man named Franklin Delano Floyd. Although she had moved with Frank, Sharon began dating another man and soon became pregnant a second time. Once again, she did not inform the baby's father about the pregnancy. This time, however, she decided to keep the child and raise him with Frank. Sharon gave birth to her son, Michael Grégory Marshall, in 1988. Frank and Sharon had a complicated relationship. It was unclear whether it was romantic, but they lived together and both cared for Sharon's son, Michael. Frank worked as a painter, but often suffered from a bad back, which meant he was seldom able to work. Consequently, Sharon took up work as an exotic dancer to support them, but they also started to depend on welfare checks to make ends meet. Her colleagues regarded Sharon as kind and friendly, and she formed a particularly close bond with an 18-year-old co-worker named Cheryl Comesso. Despite the women's friendship, Frank and Cheryl were known to have frequent arguments, though some reports suggested they may have had a brief relationship. During a weekend in 1989, Frank, Sharon, and Cheryl went on a boating trip together, where a fight erupted between Cheryl and Frank. Following this dispute, Cheryl allegedly reported Sharon to social services for misrepresenting her actual income as an exotic dancer. Sharon had been concealing some of her earnings to continue receiving government assistance, but Cheryl's call resulted in Sharon losing her eligibility for welfare. Infuriated by Cheryl's actions, Frank confronted her outside the club where both women worked. Witnesses reported that Frank struck Cheryl in the face during the altercation. Soon after, Cheryl left her father's home to stay with a friend. When she failed to call her father to confirm her safe arrival, he reported her missing. Her abandoned Corvette was found at the airport, and an investigation was launched to locate the missing woman. Both Frank and Sharon were considered persons of interest, but for years, no evidence emerged to link them to Cheryl's disappearance. The pair quickly packed their belongings and left the area, which only heightened suspicion, particularly as they began using various aliases while traveling. Frank and Sharon married in 1989, Frank asserted that the marriage was to give Sharon's son a family name, although the couple frequently used different aliases. They eventually settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Sharon once again worked as an exotic dancer. Sharon made friends easily wherever they went, but Frank was widely disliked for his aggressive and unpleasant demeanor. Reportedly, Frank again got into a conflict with another dancer Sharon worked with. When the woman shouted that Sharon should leave him, he retorted, "If she ever left me, I'd kill her." Unbeknownst to Frank, Sharon was already making arrangements to leave him for a man she'd met at her workplace. Allegedly, Sharon would have left Frank sooner, but was fearful of what he might do to her or her son, Michael, before she could ever leave, however. Sharon was the victim of a sudden accident. She was discovered unconscious by a highway, apparently the victim of a hit and run. Frank claimed he was asleep when the accident occurred. Although she was rushed to the hospital, Sharon never regained consciousness. Her friends from the club visited her as she recovered, and many claimed her condition was improving, but Frank soon prohibited them from visiting without providing an explanation. 5 days after the incident, Sharon succumbed to her injuries. Many were suspicious of Frank's peculiar behavior, especially since Sharon had seemed to be recovering before her sudden death. The doctor was also suspicious. Based on old bruises he observed on her body, he classified her death as a homicide and suggested that the fatal head injury might not have been caused by a vehicle, although no one could prove that Frank had run Sharon over or possibly killed her in the hospital. Many arrived at that conclusion. This suspicion was reinforced when her co-workers, rather than Frank, paid for her headstone. Frank soon began contacting life insurance companies to collect on the $80,000 policy he had taken out on Sharon just a few months before her death. The issue was that Frank habitually used aliases, so the social security numbers he provided did not match his names. After several attempts, he finally supplied his real name, Dot. Franklin Delano Floyd. It was then that all of Frank's deceptions began to unravel. It turned out he had a significant criminal history. In 1962, at age 19, Frank was convicted of abducting and assaulting a 4-year-old girl, for which he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. However, he escaped from the mental hospital where he was initially held by stealing a vehicle. Frank's shocking history was just beginning. The day after his escape, he robbed a bank and was subsequently recaptured. In 1972, Frank was released, but almost immediately, he attempted to abduct a woman from a gas station and was arrested again. This time, however, he posted bail but failed to appear for his court date. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest, but he quickly disappeared and started using fake names while on the run. This continued until he was forced to provide his real full name to the life insurance company. Frank tried to evade authorities, but was soon captured in Georgia and imprisoned to complete his sentence. For Sharon's friends, Frank's arrest felt like a form of justice for her untimely death. During this period, Frank had reportedly placed Michael with social services before going on the run, and Michael was subsequently placed in the foster care system with a loving family. However, everyone was taken aback by the young boy's behavior. He appeared to be non-verbal, communicating only through screams and moans. Frank maintained that he was Michael's father, and the child was frequently brought to visit him in prison. When Michael showed reluctance to visit Frank, a DNA test was eventually conducted. Although Frank initially resisted, it was discovered that, contrary to his claims, Michael was not his biological son, and the visits were terminated. But this startling story does not conclude here. It was far from over. When Frank was finally released from prison in September 1994, after serving 4 years, he began stalking Michael and his foster parents in Oklahoma. Knowing he would never be granted custody, he formulated a plan to take him. On September 12, 1994, Frank appeared at Michael's elementary school and demanded to see the principal, James Davis. When he was denied permission to take Michael, Frank brandished a gun and threatened Davis. Michael was eventually brought out without alerting anyone else at the school. Frank then forced the principal at gunpoint to drive them to a location a few miles from the school. There, Frank tied Davis to a tree, leaving him unharmed, and fled with Michael in Davis's truck. Once the abduction became known, a frantic search commenced, but it would be 2 long months before any discovery was made. Frank was located and arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, but there was no sign of Michael. Even after extensive searches, no trace of the little boy's fate was found, and Frank refused to provide any information. When questioned about Michael by the police, Frank stated, "It's none of your business where he is, nor do I care how much any of you in Oklahoma miss him or love him." The first of many twists emerged during Frank's trial for Michael's kidnapping. In 1995, skeletal remains were discovered covered in vines in Pinellas County, Florida. The remains were not immediately identified, but an investigation concluded that the victim had died from a beating and 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Later that year, a mechanic in Kansas bought a truck at an auction and found a large envelope inside containing 97 photographs of a woman who had been beaten and bound. The truck had once belonged to Frank Floyd, who had stolen it while passing through the area in 1994 before abandoning it. The photos were compared to the unidentified remains, and a wound on the photographed woman's cheekbone matched one on the recovered skull. The skeleton was soon identified as belonging to Cheryl Comesso. Frank was convicted of kidnapping Michael, who was still missing and classified as such, and was subsequently sentenced to 52 years in prison. He then faced trial for the murder of Cheryl Comesso, where he was found guilty and sentenced to the death penalty. But the photos found in the truck revealed something even more shocking, bringing another twist in this case to light. The pictures also depicted Frank assaulting a young girl, but these images were much older than those of Cheryl. A search was initiated to determine the girl's identity. This is where the case took an alarming turn. It wasn't until 2014 that Sharon's true identity was officially revealed. To uncover the truth about Sharon and the pictures, we must go back in time. After his release from prison, and while on the run for attempted abduction, Frank married Sandy Chipman in the mid-1970s. At the time, he was using the alias Brandon Williams, so Sandy was unaware of his true identity. The marriage was far from romantic, having begun with them tying the knot at a truck stop. Sandy had 4 children at the time and did not have a clean record herself. She left her children in Frank's care when she had to serve 30 days in jail for passing bad checks. When Sandy was finally released from prison, she discovered her house was empty and her children were gone. It seemed Frank had taken them and moved. It took Sandy years to find out what happened to her children, but she eventually located 2 of her daughters, Allison and Amy, living with a social services group. Despite this, Sandy could not find her eldest daughter, Suzanne, or her son, Philip. Her son was eventually found when, as a grown man, Philip came forward, and a DNA test confirmed their relationship. Frank had put him up for adoption. But what happened to Sandy's oldest daughter is even more shocking. Sharon Marshall's real name was Suzanne Marie Savakis, and she was the daughter of Sandy Chipman. In a truly disturbing twist, Frank had taken Sandy's children, separated them among different social services groups, but raised Suzanne as his own daughter. Frank and Suzanne moved frequently across several states. Frank told various stories to those around him about how he came to care for the young girl. But in most versions, he claimed to have rescued her after she was abandoned by her parents. During this time, he called her by the alias Tanya Hughes. Yet by the time she graduated from high school, she was known as Sharon Marshall. It turned out that Sharon was kidnapped as a child by Frank, her own stepfather, who then raised her, frequently assaulted her, later married her as an adult, possibly murdered her, and then abducted her child after her death. It was a twist that investigators found too incredible to be real, and yet it was true. Also revealed in 2014 was that after nearly 20 years of denials, Frank finally admitted to what many had long suspected, that he had murdered Michael by shooting him while on the run. He claimed to have hidden the body along Interstate 35, but an intensive search yielded nothing. It was later theorized that Michael's body may have been consumed by wild hogs in the area. Frank Floyd was never convicted of Sharon's murder, though popular opinion holds him responsible for this crime as well. To this day, he refuses to discuss Sharon's death. Frank remains on death row, awaiting his sentence for Cheryl's murder. Our next case is no less shocking or tragic. On August 24, 1980, Grégory Villemin was born to his parents, Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin. The family resided in L'Éponge-sur-Vologne in eastern France, where Jean-Marie worked as a factory foreman following a promotion. The couple had recently moved into a newly built home shortly before welcoming their bright baby boy. By all appearances, the family was happy and prosperous. But then events took a startling turn. The Villemin family started receiving anonymous threatening letters and phone calls, vowing revenge against Jean-Marie. The letters and calls never detailed what the sender sought revenge for, only that they were pursuing it. For over 4 years, the threats persisted and were extended to include Jean-Marie's parents. Then, on October 16, 1984, while playing in the garden, 4-year-old Grégory vanished. Christine quickly realized her son was no longer in the front yard and contacted the police. As the police initiated their search, Christine frantically drove around the small nearby village. No trace of the 4-year-old could be found. As the search went on, Grégory's uncle received an anonymous phone call stating, "I've kidnapped the boy. I've strangled him, and I've thrown him in the river Vologne. I have my revenge." The following day, before the situation could be further investigated, Jean-Marie discovered a letter that seemed to have been posted to them at the time of Grégory's abduction. It read, "I hope you die of grief, boss. Your money won't bring back your son. Here's my revenge you." Grégory's body was found later that day near Docelles and the Vologne River, just 7 kilometers from his home. He had been drowned with his hands and feet bound and his woolen hat pulled down over his face. His family was utterly devastated. The case of Grégory's murder, which horrified the French public, became known as l'affaire Grégory. The killer was soon nicknamed Le Corbeau, or the Crow, after a famous French film with a theme similar to the threatening notes the family had received. After an intense investigation, police narrowed down a suspect based on handwriting experts who analyzed the ominous letters and a key witness statement. In 1985, Bernard Laroche, Jean-Marie's cousin, was arrested and questioned following a statement from his 15-year-old sister-in-law. But Laroche denied being the Crow, and his sister-in-law soon retracted her statement, claiming it had been coerced. Although Laroche was eventually cleared and released, Jean-Marie stood before reporters and vowed that he believed Laroche was guilty of his son's murder and that he would kill him. But the case took another shocking turn on March 25, 1985, when handwriting experts determined that Grégory's own mother, Christine, may have written the threatening letters. Just 4 days later, Jean-Marie went to Laroche's workplace, determined to avenge his son's death and disbelieving his wife's guilt. There he shot and killed his own cousin as he was leaving the building. Jean-Marie was convicted of murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In July of the same year, Christine was charged with the murder of their son. She was pregnant with twins at the time and began a hunger strike to protest her innocence. For 11 days she refused to eat and was eventually freed after an appeal found she had been convicted on flimsy evidence with no clear motive. However, Christine's tragedy was not yet over. Upon her release, she collapsed and reportedly miscarried one of her babies. She was not officially cleared of all charges until 1993. Jean-Marie was released from prison in 1987, after serving only 2.5 years. After so much turmoil, the Villemin family was no closer to knowing who had killed Grégory. For decades after Grégory's death, the case continued to haunt France and was reopened and re-examined. Tests were conducted on the letters, the rope used to bind him, and DNA from Grégory's clothing and the saliva on the stamps, but to no avail. All results were found to be inconclusive. In 2017, the case was reopened once more, this time with new evidence that led to 3 arrests, shocking France again. Grégory's great-aunt, great-uncle, and his aunt were taken in for questioning, along with others, including more family members. The aunt was eventually released, but the great-aunt and great-uncle refused to speak to the police. None were convicted. A different tragedy soon followed when Magistrate Jean-Michel Lambert, who had overseen the initial investigation, took his own life due to the pressure and criticism he faced with the case remaining unsolved 33 years after Grégory's death. The reason for Grégory's death has never been confirmed, but some speculate that jealousy within the Villemin family was a possible cause. Others suggest that the letters referring to Jean-Marie as boss could imply it was work-related. In any case, no solid evidence or suspect has been identified, but nearly every family member has been under suspicion at some point. In December 2020, the case was reopened yet again, but this time police are determined to finally uncover the true identity of the Crow. New interviews have been conducted, and police are utilizing a brand new technology called stylometry, which analyzes the style, syntax, punctuation, and phrasing used in the threatening letters to identify the killer. A new suspect has been identified, but has not yet been named publicly. It seems the murder of Grégory Villemin may soon be solved. Our next case is not a typical missing persons case and features a twist that seems too surprising to be true. And yet it is. Nicholas Barclay was born on December 31st, 1980, the youngest of 3 siblings. He had a fairly normal childhood in San Antonio, Texas, but as a pre-teen, he began to develop a reputation as a troubled kid. Nicholas was known for a history of physical and verbal conflicts with his mother, truancy, threatening teachers, stealing shoes, and even breaking into a convenience store. By just 13, Nicholas had a juvenile criminal record for his actions and allegedly had 3 tattoos given to him by friends with an unsterilized needle. At some point, Nicholas was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. His mother was reportedly so overwhelmed by his need for constant supervision that she asked her older son, Jason, to move in with her to help care for the young boy. On June 13, 1994, Nicholas called home asking for a ride after playing basketball in his neighborhood. His older brother, Jason, answered the phone but refused to wake their mother, who had been working late nights, and instead told Nicholas to walk home. But he never arrived. Unfortunately, given Nicholas's reputation, few believed anything was wrong when the 13-year-old could not be found. Most were inclined to believe he had run away and would return soon. This theory was supported by the fact that he had a court hearing the day after he vanished to determine if he would be sent to a rehabilitation center. Still, after he failed to return for an unusually long time, and at his mother's insistence, an investigation into Nicholas's whereabouts finally began. For months, there was no sign of him. The only clue came 3 months after Nicholas's disappearance, when Jason called the police to report that he could hear his younger brother breaking into their garage. Yet, when police arrived, there was no evidence of forced entry, nor any sign of Nicholas. But they couldn't understand why Jason would fabricate such a story. As years passed, the Barclay family began to accept the possibility that they might never see Nicholas again. That is, until this case took a surprising and unusual turn. Few missing children cases end with the child being found. Yet in 1997, 3 years after he went missing, the Barclay family was informed that Nicholas had been found alive and safe. Despite this joyful news, there was something rather strange about the phone call. Nicholas was reportedly found in Linares, Spain, after being taken by a child trafficking ring that had transported him all the way to Europe. After years of captivity, Nicholas had managed to escape. The police informed the Barclays that Nicholas had been forced to speak only French for the 3 years he was gone and had been harmed during his time away. Carrie, Nicholas's older sister, flew to Spain to identify and bring back her missing brother. Things did not go as planned, however, as Nicholas seemed afraid of his sister, particularly of the possibility that she might not recognize him and force him to stay in Spain. When he finally allowed Carrie to see him, he kept a baseball cap and sunglasses on. Yet Carrie stated that she knew he was her brother. The two spent time together to get reacquainted, as Nicholas claimed he had very little memory of his life before being taken, his mind having blocked it out as an emotional defense mechanism. When Carrie showed him family photos, Nicholas appeared to recall certain things and people, such as asking her if Grandpa was still an a-hole. Before he was permitted to return home with Carrie, Nicholas had to pass a test where police showed him family photos that Carrie hadn't reviewed with him, and he had to correctly identify the people in them. Nicholas made only one minor error, and so he was allowed to return home to Texas with Carrie. Although the Barclays were thrilled to have Nicholas back, there were a few things they couldn't overlook. The most obvious was that their brother had been blonde with blue eyes when he was taken. But the boy who returned from Spain had dark hair and brown eyes. Nicholas had an extraordinary explanation for his change in appearance. He claimed that to conceal his identity, his captors had performed experiments to change his hair and eye color so no one would recognize him as Nicholas. He also spoke with a heavy French accent, but this was explained by his story of being forced to speak only French for 3 years. The family was so relieved to finally have Nicholas home, that they actively disregarded some of the concerns raised by authorities and even told investigators to close the case. A film crew heard about the incredible story and asked to follow the Barclays to document Nicholas's adjustment to family life. They consented, and that's when everything began to unravel. A local private detective working with the crew grew increasingly suspicious of the French-speaking, dark-haired Nicholas. He launched his own investigation and took a picture of Nicholas's ears to compare with earlier photos. He discovered they did not match, and since ears do not change with age, he brought his concerns to the authorities. By February 1998, after Nicholas had been living with the Barclays for 5 months, the FBI got involved, obtaining a court order to investigate. When Nicholas's fingerprints and DNA were taken, it was determined that the man the Barclays believed to be their Nicholas was actually a 23-year-old Frenchman named Frédéric Pierre Bourdin. Frédéric was a notorious con artist known as the Chameleon, with over 500 different identities. Despite this shocking revelation, the Barclays refused to believe that Frédéric wasn't Nicholas, even when Frédéric admitted in court to being an imposter and pleaded guilty to passport fraud and perjury. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. This revelation raised many questions. Where was the real Nicholas? How had the Barclays been fooled? And why did Frédéric do it? While this case is utterly shocking, the imposter is not the only twist. Investigators were troubled by the Barclay family's behavior throughout the incident and their willing acceptance of Frédéric. Frédéric himself later commented on the controversy, stating that even he was amazed at how easily the Barclays accepted him, which cast more suspicion on the family. Frédéric even claimed that the Barclays knew he wasn't Nicholas, but that they had all pretended and played along with his deception, and he couldn't understand why. He reported that when he met Carey, she had supplied him with information about the family, telling him who everyone was and what to remember. She had allegedly helped him pass the police test before he was allowed to travel to the US. Frédéric also said that Jason had never accepted him or pretended to. In fact, upon meeting him, all Jason had said to Frédéric was "good luck." The phone call Jason made 3 months after Nicholas disappeared suddenly became a clue. Police noted that such calls are not uncommon when someone has been murdered, as the killer often tries to create the impression that the victim may still be alive. This is precisely what the private investigator and Frédéric believe happened. He believes the family accepted him so willingly because they, or specifically Jason, had killed Nicholas and were more than happy to cover it up by claiming he was the real Nicholas. Before Jason could be investigated, he died of a drug overdose. It is reported that he had long struggled with a cocaine addiction. No further evidence emerged, and the case went cold. Frédéric completed his prison sentence and continued to steal identities across Europe. Nicholas has never been found, but his story inspired the popular Netflix documentary, The Imposter,